Hello AWS friends. In the last video we have seen how to create our first CDK project, CDK with Python, and create our own resources, add new stacks, structure the project, and also deploy the resources to our account with the AWS command line. So by CDK deploy, CDK destroy, and so on. Now let's create a AWS CodePipeline in our account and deploy our resources not by the command line but by the AWS CodePipeline with continuous integration and deployment. You find the link to my GitHub repository CDK CodePipeline in the description for this video, and you should clone this and then get started with this project. Before we get it running, we have some manual steps to do this time. So it's good to take a look in the README and see what are the actions we have to perform. So for our code pipeline in AWS we will need some kind of source, right? So since I want to use my GitHub repository, I will need to do and create here a connection in the developer tools close to the code pipeline. So you can create here a connection, and for GitHub this works, for example, perfectly. You could also create a code commit repository, but for GitHub, for example, this means you have to go in your settings, and there in applications you have to create this AWS connector for GitHub, and you have to select your repository. For example, this one is this. Once this is configured, you can see an active connection here in the developer tool. That's what we're gonna need. So you have to actually kind of push this repository once it's cloned to your GitHub or to your code commit, and also create here a connection close to the code pipeline. So this was step number one for the setup. Create the GitHub app connection. And now the CDK JSON, we have to adapt the CDK JSON. So the important attributes here are, you need here the accounts where you want to deploy. So basically we're gonna have a tool chain or tooling account where you have to add here the account number and the region. You have here 3 stage accounts in the setup, so you can also maybe deploy to just one stage to dev. For this example, that's pretty fine. I'm going to use here for this tutorial the tooling and the dev account with the same account. Actually, I don't want to deploy right now to 2 different accounts. It's pretty fine adding here the same account number. You have to use here your VPC. So just go to your VPC settings and paste the VPC ID. The branch of course must fit to your branch in your GitHub or other source repository, and also by now the code, the connection we have just created, you find here in the settings. You have to paste in here and save. Now it's time to have a look in the app Python file. So in this file we have at the very beginning a Bootstrap stack. This is going to create the roles we need to deploy from CodePipeline to the stage account. So we have here for the dev account a stack, for the QA account, and for the prod account. And finally we get the pipeline itself, which must be for the very first time deployed by CDK deploy. It cannot deploy itself. But once it's have been created, this pipeline will run and deploy the follow-up changes in our repository. Here's another pipeline for prod. So this one will deploy dev and QA. Once dev is finished, you have to confirm and you can deploy QA as a next step in the pipeline. The prod is separated. So for example, you can limit the prod execution with IAM, and therefore it's its own pipeline. So now we can make a CDK synth in our project, which should actually then list all these stacks we have added here in our app Python file. So the Bootstrap dev role stack, the QA role stack and the prod role stack, and also the pipeline, the CDK pipeline. The CDK pipeline for prod is commented out, so we're not gonna have this. And by now the first step would be actually to deploy the Bootstrap dev role stack, but first of course we will make a CDK Bootstrap, since this is the very first time we have opened the project and we don't have yet here in our account as a CDK toolkit. So let's execute this one here, and this should create now our first CloudFormation template in the account, in the toolchain account, which you can see over here, which does not hold any resources yet. It's creating the stack, the CloudFormation template, and in a second we should be able, yes, here to see the CDK toolkit, which is created in progress. It's gonna take a while. I'm gonna pause the video and be back in a second. So the CDK Bootstrap command executed successfully. The create complete here on the stack, on the CDK toolkit stack is there. Now we can continue and we can deploy our Bootstrap dev role stack. There's actually a K missing, so I have to re-execute this one. It should throw an error here. And now this one is fine, this command, and this would mean we get here one more stack deployed with a role for the deployment for the code pipeline itself. Since I have added my CDK JSON with only one account, so Bootstrap and dev account is the same account, it's gonna be deployed here in my account, where also the pipeline is gonna be later on. But for example, in your project, this should be now in your second account, in the dev account, and we have to wait here also some seconds until the role has been created. The role stack is deployed, and we can see here the code build role from toolchain account. And now we can continue. That's a good point of time to make a list command here in our project, and we will see by now by the list command all the stacks actually we get in our project. So we will take a closer look to the project and the stacks in a second, but for now we should see a couple of more stacks, not only the code pipeline but also the ones I have added there in the stages. So perfect, so we see here the dev, the QA, and also the pipeline itself. And now I will really deploy the pipeline. As mentioned, for the first time this has gonna be happen with the CDK deploy command. Once it has been deployed, it will be able to deploy the other stacks, the dev lambda stacks, the dev job devs, the S3 stack, whatever is added here in the pipeline by itself. So now we're gonna deploy the CDK pipeline, and it's gonna be deployed here in the account, in the toolchain account, also with CloudFormation. I have to confirm. We got some roles here, some IAM stuff. It's creating the CloudFormation chain set or the CloudFormation template. And let's update here. Right, CDK pipeline is in progress, and this is gonna take some time. I'm gonna pause the video again, and I'll be back once it has been deployed. So perfect, our pipeline has been created. Let's confirm on the CloudFormation console, yes, create complete, and by now we actually should be able to see our pipeline here in Code Pipelines, and it's already in progress, so it starts with the first step. Let's have a look here on the design of the pipeline, and then we're gonna take a look on the code, how it was actually coded there in the CDK with Python. So here we got the source step. This is pointing to our connection we just have set up, and this means to my GitHub account. Then we have the build step, where actually the synthesize command happening, and here we got an update pipeline, a self-mutate step. So whenever you do a change in the pipeline, it's gonna make changes in the pipeline, so it's gonna be able to self-mutate itself, but as mentioned, it's not gonna be able to deploy itself for the first time. Got some assets here for the CloudFormation stacks, and here we have the toolchain account stacks. These are these ones, and then we got the dev bootstrap and the stacks for the dev account, and then we got QA bootstrap and the QA account. So this is a complete pipeline, and now we can, meanwhile this is running, actually take a look on the CDK project, how this pipeline was really set up. So how do a code pipeline look like in the CDK with Python? You can see here in our app Python file, this one is a project pipeline stack with being created with these parameters. So I got here in my infrastructure CI/CD folder this project pipeline stack, and I'm showing here a feature which is great in CDK, which is possible there in the object-oriented languages like Python, for example, which you cannot do in CloudFormation, for example, or with flat files in infrastructure as code. So I'm creating here a project pipeline stack which got the superclass pipeline stack, which is kind of a generic stack, and therefore we have to look like in both stacks to understand what is this file going to do. Actually, as you can see here, as a subclass, the project pipeline stack is quite small. It's only calling the super constructor, and there's one method override here which gonna alter the behavior of the superclass a little bit, but besides this one override, actually the code from the superclass is gonna be the relevant code, and as you can see by here, here's all the important stuff we need to create a code pipeline with CDK. Now let's take a closer look in our pipeline stack, the superclass. So first of all, we need here some variables. We get these from the config, which is passed from the app, and these are basically from the CDK JSON. So we get the accounts, we get the region, we get the ID from the dev account, toolchain account, and so on. We need the connection for the source, and we got the repo owner, and also we got the repo. And then also there's a passed parameter which branch we should use. So first we need the 3 roles for the dev, for the QA, and for the prod account. And then it starts actually with the actions. So here we got the code pipeline source, which you have seen in the pipeline at the very beginning, which is checking out the code from, in my case, from my GitHub account, or it could be also code commit or whatever you have set up there in the connection settings. Then we have the synth step, which will do the synthesize of the templates. And then we have the creation of the pipeline itself, and as you can see here, this is this block of code. Next we are editing our pipeline. So we are adding here the stages. We got a toolchain stage, and later on we have here a stage for the dev. This is this one here. We got a stage for QA, and if and only if it's a prod pipeline, so we add here the stage for the prod pipeline. So by now let's have a look in our stage files, which are separated from the pipeline. So we have here in infrastructure and CI/CD the project pipeline stack, but we have also here a toolchain deploy and an app deploy. And as you can see, these are from type stage. And in the toolchain account, or in the toolchain stage, for example, you can add only the resources you might need in the toolchain account, maybe some common resources for the stages. I have here some example, a simple ECR stack. And then we got the app stage, so for the stage itself, where you normally will add quite some resources. This is going to be deployed then, for example, in the dev or the QA or in prod. In my case, I'm creating a 3 bucket, a job definition, and also a lambda. So back to our pipeline. As we have seen, first we add the stage for the toolchain account, which we can find here in the pipeline after the self-mutate in this step here, toolchain. And we have here the ECR repo stack. There's always a prepare and a deploy. And we can see here it's not only added to the pipeline, but it's also adding here unit tests and lambda tests. And you can find them here, lambda test and unit test. So they are here in a private method, or in a method actually. So in this way you can override this method here in the project pipeline stack whenever you need to, for example, edit the pipeline for a special need. So this way you can add, for example, your pipeline stack as a generic pipeline, and you can create more pipelines with different kind of use cases and override the parts. For example, if you don't need unit tests for one pipeline, or you have to execute different commands, you can subclass this in your project pipeline and edit the commands or the steps you want to edit. So we have here added our toolchain, we have added lambda tests, and now we are adding the dev stage actually. You can see the toolchain is right now in progress. It's deploying the ECR repo by now, and once it's done it should come to the next step, to the dev stage. You can find here the stacks, the job dev. We have seen the lambda stack and the S3 stack, and we can also find here, as we can see, we are adding here integration test, and we are also adding acceptance test. You can see the acceptance test and the integration test in this stage, in this step. And at the very end of the dev step, once the dev has been deployed and all the integration acceptance steps have been successfully executed, we add a manual approval step, which you can see here. So once the pipeline has reached this point, we have to manually approve the QA, and then it will continue on the QA deployment. Let's have a look. Our pipeline is still running. So we had the update pipeline. We have the toolchain deployment, so it was only the ECR repo, and we had here the unit and the lambda test. So this means, since we have defined the toolchain account in our CDK setting, which is here the same account where I'm in, we should find by now the toolchain ECR repo stack. Yes, and it has been created. After the toolchain deployment, next is the deployment of the dev stage. Since I have configured the dev account also as the same account where I'm in here, I will also be able to find these stacks then deployed in the same account. Normally these dev stacks should actually be in a different AWS account. So if you configure this correctly, and should not be here in the toolchain in the tooling account. But as I wanted to keep this example simple, we can see here the dev, the ECR, there's one more ECR repo, there are job definition, there's a lambda stack, and there's a S3 stack. They have been also being deployed here in the same account. And by now you can see we had here the stacks, the job definition, the lambda, the S3, and then we have acceptance test, we have integration test, which all succeeded, and by now we have here an approval step. So to continue with the deployment for the QA, we will now have to actually manually approve the step, and then it would continue to deploy the QA. So in my case this doesn't make much sense since I have configured the QA as the same account, but if you configure the QA as it should be with a different account ID, then the same stacks would be the same 4 stage stacks would then be deployed to the QA account. Let's take a closer look here in the project itself so you can understand the most important files. Of course, we have already seen the up Python, which is the entry point of the whole application, which defines the stacks. And here we got the most important is our pipeline stack. So if we want to deploy also the prod, you have to comment out this out and deploy the prod pipeline also. So once then you will find here 2 pipelines, the CDK, there's a pipeline for the dev and the QA account, and the second pipeline for the prod, so which you have to trigger differently, and there might be developers who are able to execute the dev and QA pipeline, but the prod pipeline is maybe only being allowed for the tech lead or the product owner. Then we have here some tests, the acceptance and the integration tests. These are basically just dummy tests for yet they're not doing a lot of stuff. I have here a folder for my Lambda source, so you find here basically a very simple Lambda which is going to be deployed. So this one please adapt and include here your real Lambda code. And here's the infrastructure folder. As you can see, there is a bunch of example files. Important here is the CI/CD. Here is our project pipeline stack, and here are the 2 stages for the app deployment and for the toolchain deployment. And there's also a folder generic, where again some constructs which might be reused. So if I have a stack and I think this is kind of really generic, I put them here in this generic infrastructure folder, and this I might reuse in other project only also. For example, is the CI/CD, the pipeline stack we have seen, the superclass is in here, so that should not be edited a lot in different project. Also there is the IAM roles for the pipeline itself, which might not be changed. We can also verify if the GitHub triggers are working fine, so maybe I do a small change in my app deploy and gonna push this to my GitHub account, and this should actually trigger the pipeline, and when everything is configured correctly, so it should run here and here. Again, it's still in progress here, but anyway it should be run again, so you can execute the pipeline not only once, you can execute it in parallel. So also, yeah, you can see it, but it's already has passed the source, and by now it's in the build. So this is also working fine, and that's it basically. So by now it's up to you to create your own pipeline. So take a look here in the README, clone this repo, and please also have a look in my blog. You find some useful information there. There's a blog about the CDK pipeline. There's also a blog about how to create stacks and what are really constructs in the CDK. Don't forget, once you have cloned the project, you have to adapt the CDK JSON with your account numbers and your connection, for example, or branch names, which might differ from my example CDK. Then you have first, of course, to push it to your GitHub or code commit repository, and once this has been completed, you can finally deploy the pipeline, first the roles, then the pipeline, and then you should be able to run your pipeline successfully in your account. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the code pipeline and the CDK. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next video.